Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our online class. I want to remind you of the requirements each week. I want you to make 3 discussion board posts. 1 is your own, and 2 are comments on other people's posts. I'd like that initial discussion board post to be made by Thursday night, and your 2 follow-up posts to be made by Sunday night. If you've fallen a little behind, have no fear. I'm behind myself, so I absolutely take late work, and I understand that life intervenes, and you've all got crazy things going on in your lives right now. So I want you to be successful. I want to be successful myself, so I take late stuff. So in addition to the discussion board posts, I want focus questions to be emailed to me by Sunday of each night, and then there are going to be 2 papers in this class. I had originally planned to have you send me a proposal for your first paper by the end of week 4. That's this week. But I've since decided to go differently on that. I'm using a new book and some different readings this semester than I did last time I taught this course. And last time I taught the course, I used a theoretical book on Islamophobia in America, then a series of Soviet news clippings on the U.S., as well as a hodgepodge of scholarly sources. It was a really intellectually fun way to approach the class, but maybe a bit too meta-analytical for some people. Not that they couldn't understand, but they didn't like it. So the 2 books together that I used last time also cost like $50. This book, which I love, Lepore, is amazing, and it's only $20. So this week, of course, the readings are not from the textbook, but usually they will be. So anyways, that's a long aside for me basically to say I want to cover a little more material before I have you write the first paper. So your proposal will not be due this week. I think it will make for more engaging papers to wait a bit. So I put the assignment up for you to look at, but won't require a proposal for 2 more weeks, and won't require the paper to be due for another 3 weeks. So for the proposal, I want to see that you found at least one scholarly source and have a clear argument or thesis for your paper. So this week, I gave you an outside reading from the same source I used last week, Osterhammel, that considers the colonization of the American West from a transnational perspective. I also gave you a reading that illustrates a Cherokee fable to get you thinking, kind of outside the box. And then there's also a reading from a grade school textbook from 1898, so we're being just as meta-historical as last time around. So this first slide is meant to get you thinking about the way we mythologize the West. For me, up here, this movie, Dances with Wolves, was a really important turning point in my life. It was the first time that I had ever seen a movie where the Indians weren't just one-dimensional bad guys. I was far more accustomed to other westerns, the kinds that are pictured here, and think it's kind of cool to have myself right next to them, where than I was with a complicated portrayal. So my older brother took me to see Dances with Wolves at our local drive-in movie theater when it came out, and it was also the first time I had ever tried Strawberry Shasta. Those are 2 good things, expanding my mind, expanding my palate. But so for me, very much that interpretation that the native peoples were the good guys, that was a big turning point for me. So as we discuss the colonization of the West, I want to complicate simplistic assumptions without downplaying the fact that in the end, native peoples found themselves at a tremendous loss. And the reason they found themselves at such a tremendous loss was because Euro-American settlers found themselves at a tremendous advantage at their expense. As always, I'll conclude this with some bonus questions as well. All right, so let's start with a little discussion of Texas. Outright imperialism, meaning just the straight-up taking of land without a legal pretext. So you might remember from your other studies that in 1803, the United States made the Louisiana Purchase from France. By doing so, they gained ownership to a large swath of Western territory, which the French didn't necessarily have the right to grant, as they hadn't consulted with the many different native nations already living on that land. But Thomas Jefferson didn't worry about that detail, so despite the enormousness of the Louisiana Purchase quite early on, the U.S. began to expand even beyond that. This expansion was very much driven by the desire of large slaveholders to expand their land needed for cultivation. So in 1819, Florida was seized from Spain largely to go after African slaves who had escaped there and to get the land. By the 1830s, cotton had become such an important commodity that elite Southerners were doing anything they could to expand its cultivation. The combined factors of a willingness to take land belonging to others, insatiable global demand, and a booming population meant that there was broad consensus on the need to expand into new territories. The soil on cotton plantations as well was notoriously poorly managed, meaning rather than use proper fertilizers, even as understood in the 19th century, or crop rotations, planters would very often just exhaust the soil, then move on. So in the early 1820s, one of those areas they wanted to move to included Texas. When Mexico gained its independence in 1821, they agreed that with the United States that their country would extend to the border of modern-day Louisiana and essentially diagonally across the rest of the continent up to the top of California. What both Mexicans and Americans ignored, though, were native people. So in Texas, for example, the Comanche Empire and the Apaches were the ones really in charge. So to help cement their control over the area, the Mexican government was eager for anyone who could reliably settle and pay taxes and offer a buffer against the powerful native tribes. So they granted early Euro-American colonists rights as empresarios, or entrepreneurs, to settle in Texas. By the 1830s, far more Americans came into the area than the Mexican authorities were prepared for, and one point of contention was slavery. Slavery was illegal in Mexico. It had never really taken root there to begin with. There were far too few Europeans and too much area for slaves to escape into. They certainly tried slavery early on, but instead opted for feudal control over native peoples and mestizo peasants. The American immigrants, for the most part, ignored Mexican law related to slavery. So, in part to ensure their control of slaves, American settlers declared independence in 1836 and fought for that the Texas Republic and fought for that independence over the next 6 years. One of the early battles was at the Alamo, which is pictured here, where a Tennessee congressman, Davy Crockett, was killed, as well as a frontiersman that they named a knife after, Jim Bowie. Many Texans also sought unification with the United States of America after this. One sticking point after 1842 was the Texas border with Mexico. Mexicans said it was at the Nueces River. Texans said it was farther south on the Rio Grande. So this essentially set the stage for another war with Mexico, this time with the United States of America, not with Texas. So not all Mexicans agreed with the treaty that had where can I put myself? In the middle of the Mexican-American War? Right down there. Um, not all Mexicans even agreed with the treaty recognizing Texas independence, so they took it as an extremely hostile act when the United States voted to annex Texas in 1845. That same year, President Polk sent expeditions to the Nueces River and sent a secret expedition to California. In early 1846, Mexican troops along the Nueces fired on American troops, and Congress declared war. So over the next 2 years, the vastly numerically superior American forces sent expeditions across the American South and West and landed at Veracruz in Mexico, marching straight to Mexico City, briefly holding it until the Mexicans agreed to cede what are today the states of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California to the United States. So in 1848, then, the territory of the United States stretched across almost the entirety of what is today our country. There would still be the Gadsden Purchase of southern Arizona, Alaska, Hawaii, and all of the overseas territories, including notably Puerto Rico, to come. Many Northerners were bitterly opposed to this annexation, as they rightly saw it as naked imperialism at the behest of slave owners. Thoreau, for instance, just refused to pay taxes and went to jail in protest. The Whig Party was largely opposed to it, and abolitionists found this annexation to be absolutely abhorrent. But I want to point out and make it clear that one-dimensional stereotyping is inaccurate whichever way it goes. So when I was a kid, as I pointed out, I thought that the Indians were the bad guys. By the time I was in high school, I felt through many pop history sources that it was actually the Europeans who were, completely the bad guys, one-dimensional bad guys. And That perspective, while important, ignores the hundreds of thousands of Americans who were adamantly opposed to the oppression of Native peoples, war with Mexico, imperialism, slavery, everything, both then and now. And some were even brave enough to choose prison over support for what they felt to be evil. Had more been willing to go that route, perhaps some of these less savory elements of our history might have never happened. So, another one of Polk's goals as president, there we go, was to lay claim to Oregon territory as far north as possible. So after the War of 1812, Britain and the United States agreed to joint occupancy of the area north of Mexico and in between the Louisiana Purchase and the Pacific Ocean. The British were interested in fur trading, while at least initially there was little American presence in this area. This changed after the late 1830s when American settlers began following a fur trader trail west known as the Oregon Trail. By the early 1840s, Americans far outnumbered British people in the territory, and there was brief talk of war. Some Americans later hoped for a 54-40 parallel or fight, 54-40 or fight, meaning to have the border of American Oregon extend all the way up to the base of Russian Alaska. Instead, there was a peaceful treaty in 1846 putting the border at the 49th parallel, where it still stands today. By 1846, thousands of settlers had already braved the Oregon Trail. First wave of immigration to Utah Territory and much of the broader West by cutting a trail that ran roughly parallel to the Oregon Trail until it diverged towards the Great Salt Lake, where they would build Salt Lake City. When these settlers first went west, they were hoping to escape persecution in Missouri and Illinois, so they intentionally found territory in Mexico, intentionally looking for land. Oops, I'm in the way there. Put me right here with the pioneers. Um, so they intentionally found land that they hoped would not be desirable to other people. So only shortly after the initial settlers arrived, many more followed, and roughly 70,000 people would come on wagon trains before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So Mormon settlers are also important to consider in light of the Indian Wars of the 1860s through the 1890s. So these wars were one of the most imperialistic moments in American history. The U.S. government conducted a campaign of terror against Native peoples with the goal of dispossessing them of the best lands in the name of progress. So one of the points I want to reemphasize, though, is that both then and now, many Americans were against the horrors being inflicted on the natives. Mormons, like many religious groups, had religious reasons to treat natives well. I mean, basic Christianity, love thy neighbor. That's not just Christianity, that's every religion. So many as well wanted them as converts. But because of their unique theology and at the time open fear of the U.S. government, Mormons also sought out Native peoples as allies. So when Native people converted, which happened frequently, many Mormons felt like it affirmed their theology and view of how the end of times might look. That's not to say they didn't also have conflict with Native peoples. That happened as well, but these were typically minor conflicts as compared to other conflicts in the West, and nowhere near the level of conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. government. So the next two slides are meant to just show you, oh, where are we? First, how the West was annexed by the United States. So we've got the Louisiana Purchase here, what was taken with Texas, what was taken after the Mexican-American War, the Gadsden Purchase, and then the treaty recognizing U.S. control over this portion of the Oregon Territory. Then I've got three major trails used for the settlement of the West: the Oregon Trail going up through here, the Mormon Trail, which runs kind of parallel and also very quickly extended into California, and oops, I didn't include the Santa Fe Trail, but goes down here to Santa Fe. So another large group who we talked about last week who went west very early on were those people who went for gold. And we covered them last week in light of their influence on Chinese immigration to the United States. This week, my focus isn't so much on settlers, it's on those people whose lives were fundamentally changed by the settlement. So a really significant turning point in the deterioration of native and settler relations occurred during the American Civil War, when faith in peaceful means to resolve differences had already been eroded by the fact that Americans were fighting the bloodiest war in their history, uh, for Americans at least. So as the Civil War began to heat up, the federal government, marshaling its powers like never before in American history, really tended to take military solutions to things that might have had other kinds of solutions. And a lot of this had to do with the actual policies of people on the ground as well. So what that meant is that some areas of government responsibility weren't being fulfilled as they had been before either. Oh, sorry, let me try and fix this. I realize you're kind of cut off. Whoops, whoops, whoops. Is that better? Okay. Um, so, for example, in 1851, the federal government had negotiated a deal with the Santee Sioux, or sometimes called the Woodland Sioux in Minnesota, to have them give up 24 million acres of their land in exchange for moving to a smaller reservation where they would receive $50,000 a year from the government. You know, realizing that they were already outnumbered, the Sioux agreed to it, somewhat grudgingly. The federal government, since 1851, had honored this agreement, but by 1862 the payments didn't arrive, and the Sioux happened to be starving from a poor harvest year. So a group of Sioux went to meet with the federal agent at Fort Ridgely, where in Minnesota, where they were also met by a group of traders. They asked to be given a loan and were rather incensed that the fort was filled with flour while their people were starving. One of the traders, a person named Andrew Myrick, apparently said to the Sioux that they could eat grass and dung if they were hungry. I'm assuming that's not what he really said, but dung was probably the term recorded for the sake of propriety. So the Sioux returned and held a council. Some felt that since the Civil War was ongoing, the federal government wouldn't have the forces necessary to deal both with the Confederacy and a Native American uprising. They thought it might be their chance to drive the settlers out and reclaim their land in Minnesota. Little Crow, who had been to Washington, D.C., and seen trains of soldiers headed for conflict in the South, disagreed and maintained the U.S. government had enough force to deal both with the natives and the Southern Rebellion. So before they had made a decision, another factor tipped some opinions in favor of going on the offensive among the natives. Four native teenagers had wandered to a settlement near New Ulm and broken into a chicken coop. One of the kids objected to stealing the eggs, while his companions accused him of cowardice. So, you know, they were trying to one up each other to see if they'd steal some eggs. And in the scuffle, one of them dropped some eggs, they made some noise, and a woman came in to confront them. They killed her. In their fright, they ended up killing her family. They ended up killing a neighboring family, and and then they ran away. So they immediately admitted their guilt to the Native Council, and fearing vengeance at the hands of the settlers, after this event occurred, more natives decided that they were in favor of a preemptive attack. So Little Crow's desire for peace lost out. Once war became inevitable, or at least once they had decided on the path of war is never inevitable, he and several other leaders argued that they should overwhelm Fort Ridgely, as that was the strategic military point. But several in attendance instead wanted to attack the nearby town of New Ulm to get supplies. So in the end, the native troops split up rather than concentrate their forces on Fort Ridgely. They didn't have enough forces to take the fort and lost the element of surprise in attacking New Ulm. The settlers of New Ulm built barricades and were ready to defend themselves. Thankfully, a potential massacre of settlers was avoided by the brave defense that these people mounted. The natives ended up losing both battles. Fresh U.S. troops arrived and quickly defeated the uprising. These troops then arrested hundreds of natives. 300 of them were sentenced to death by military court martial. Abraham Lincoln was able to intervene before these deaths were carried out and personally commuted all but 36 of the death sentences. One thing I should point out too is that in their attack on Fort Ridgely, the Native Americans did happen to capture Andrew Myrick, and they killed him and, you know, filled his mouth with feces and grass as a testament to how angry they were at him. But anyways, so Abraham Lincoln personally commuted all but 36 of the death sentences. So in what would end up being the largest mass execution in U.S. history, 38 people would be hung just weeks later, and 38 people were hung instead of 36 due to a clerical error. So pretty outrageous. These people, the survivors then were banished from Minnesota to the Dakotas. So as they were being exiled, as they were being deported, they first went down the Mississippi River to Dubuque, Iowa, and as they were disembarking from a steamship in Dubuque for their forced deportation west, a Lakota Sioux person named Sitting Bull was there visiting and witnessed a crowd of people hurling rotten vegetables, rocks, and spitting at these refugees. This hardened his own resolve to fight against the U.S. government. In the end, though, what I want you to think about is who were really the bad guys in this conflict. The natives were the ones who attacked first, after murdering two completely innocent families. Uh, and the settlers in New Ulm especially had every right to defend themselves. Yet, the U.S. government was oblivious to the plight of the Native Americans. They caused it. They caused it by not making good on their promise and not even doing something very basic like just giving them some of the limited supplies available at Fort Ridgely. So, there was a lot of bad to go around here. You can certainly see that there was motivation and yet a right on the part of settlers to defend themselves. So it's who is the bad guy and who is the good guy is a lot more complicated in this scenario than simplistic assumptions on either side would make them out to be. So I want to go over some less ambiguous examples where the bad guys are pretty clear. Two other examples that occurred during the Civil War, really emphasizing how critical this war was to the breakdown of relations between the federal government and native tribes. So the Navajo were part of Mexico until 1848 when they were conquered by the United States. In the early years of American colonization, there was conflict between them and government forces, but after a treaty, again in 1851, the U.S. recognized their territory rights and things calmed down. The Navajo were incredibly prosperous farmers and ranchers. Their sheep and wool products were coveted trade items by outsiders, and their orchards, especially their peaches, were amazing. So when the Civil War started, the Confederacy claimed New Mexico. New Mexican territory was one of the thorns that caused the Civil War to begin with. Northerners absolutely did not want slavery to expand there, but Southerners eventually pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act that allowed for settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether to be slave or free, which many Northerners argued gave disproportionate power to slave owners who had more resources to settle first. So once they defeated a Confederate attempt to take New Mexico, the Union stationed troops at Fort Ojo de Oso, and over the next couple of years developed friendly relations with the neighboring Navajo. The Navajo would come frequently to trade and race horses at Ojo de Oso. So during one of these races, a star Navajo racer fell from his horse and lost the race. He discovered that someone had cut his stirrup, so the Navajo refused to pay the soldiers for the bets they had lost. The new commanding officer at the time, James Carleton, ordered his troops to fire uh, based on the Navajo not being willing to pay their gambling debts. Many troops refused. The artillery crews straight up disobeyed the order, but many obeyed, and there was a massacre that led to the Navajo Wars. So in the war, the Navajo were pushed off the best lands of New Mexico. Thousands perished in their deportation to a barren reservation, which, you know, with a little bit of changes, basically remains their reservation to this day on the border of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Many Navajo, as well, mourned that federal troops cut down their peach trees, as nothing but an act of spite. So, out, out in the Eastern presses, people were outraged, and this outrage caused Carleton to be relieved of his command, and a commission was set up to investigate his crimes. Again, I want to emphasize that plenty of people in the U.S. were opposed to atrocities against Native Americans, yet most Americans' standards of living also went up because of the exploitation of native land and resources. But by no means were Americans cheering what was happening to the Navajo. So many in the Northeast in particular were absolutely against it. So another horrifying example of frontier violence occurred in Colorado, again, where the Union was worried the Confederacy might try to make inroads. In the 1860s, there was another factor. There was a radical group of Cheyenne known as Dog Soldiers who were carrying out terrorist attacks on settlers in the broader West. Colorado was not a military priority in the middle of the Civil War, so in this atmosphere of heightened fear but lack of qualified personnel, a certain John Shivington was able to get himself a commission eventually as a colonel, despite having no military experience. He had failed in the clergy and in politics, but figured if he could prove his worth as an Indian fighter, it might help his prospects. So in November 1864, his troops met with a peaceful band of Cheyenne led by a person named Black Kettle. Black Kettle came to meet with him, showing him papers, a flag, and a medal he had received from Abraham Lincoln, basically trying to show that he was a friend to the U.S. and had a document to prove it. Yet early in the morning on November 29, 1864, while people were still asleep, and despite the fact that both an American flag and a white flag flew from Black Kettle's tent, Shivington's men opened fire. They murdered mostly women and children. To their credit, entire companies of men under Shivington's command refused the order to fire, but they also did nothing to prevent their fellow soldiers from carrying out mass murder. Colonel Shivington, in response to these atrocities, was relieved of his command, and the massacre caused outrage in the East, especially a year later when a photograph taken of a child's skull with a bullet hole in it was published in um, Eastern newspapers. So this massacre really hardened the resolve of so many Native people to resist. It also, was a brief moment in outrage that ultimately didn't stop the dispossession and systemic attacks happening to Native peoples. So one of the most iconic battles of the Indian Wars occurred at the Little Bighorn in 1876 when a confederation of 30,000 Plains natives attacked General George Custer's 7th Cavalry, which was in a campaign to force them back to their reservations. In the attack, 5 of his 7 companies were completely annihilated. 268 men, including Custer, were killed. So after this attack, the Confederation split up, and roughly half of them fled into Canada. By 1890, then, they returned and, were still practicing their millenarian Sundance ritual, which terrified American military forces. Um, so, at Wounded Knee, in an attempt to disarm the Sioux in 1890, while the federal troops were confiscating weapons, a shot was fired out, and troops used that as a pretext to just start shooting. And in this massacre, roughly 300 men, women, and children were killed. You see a mass grave being filled in this picture. Um, so by 1890, the last holdouts of American resistance, the Apache, the Nez Perce, and the Sioux, had all been defeated. For so many Native Americans, though, one of the lasting legacies of 19th century imperialism wasn't the sometimes genocidal violence of the frontier wars. It was the far more pervasive and long lasting attempt to destroy families, to destroy traditions and cultures through the notorious Indian boarding schools, which were joint government and private initiatives that sometimes lasted well into the 20th century, as late as the year 2000 in one location. Children would often be forced away from their parents to schools meant to instill what operators felt to be superior cultural values. Abuse was rampant, and there was little accountability for sexual abusers in particular. These schools also undervalued Native intellect, preparing them for entry level positions rather than trying to give them knowledge considered too complex for Native people. So, unlike the frontier wars, these had overwhelming support as a seemingly humane situation to the Indian problem, really predicated upon American racist attitudes that Native peoples were inferior and needed the benevolence of American goodness. The reality was anything but. I mean, these were torturous, horrifying experiences for people. So, one thing I want to emphasize is here are your bonus questions is that There wasn't much unique about the way Americans imperialized the western frontier, other than perhaps its scope and scale. This was a global phenomenon during the 19th century, and not justifying it, just trying to explain it. So by 1890, when the American frontier was considered closed, Africa had been divided among a handful of European states. Most of Asia was also colonized. Russians had expanded to the Pacific and deep into Central Asia. Native peoples in Australia and New Zealand, most of Central and South America, had been displaced by those who followed ideologies of superiority. Ideas like that of what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden justified this imperialism as supposedly helping the people that they killed and impoverished by giving them a superior European culture. So, in actual frontier regions around the world, massacres were a very common tool of imperialism as well, much like the American Indian Wars. So we'll talk more about imperialism in coming weeks. For now, take a stab at these focus questions, and as always, please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.